Welcome to the Common Good Podcast, a conversation about the significance of place, eliminating economic isolation, and the structure of belonging. My name is Joey Taylor, and in this episode, April Donor and I speak with Quanita Roberson and Dr. Amy Howton about their new book, The InnerGround Railroad. In this book, they share their individual journeys of a shared bondage and freedom, and invite readers to walk their own healing journey. Quanita describes herself as the promise of forgiveness and reconciliation in the world. And Amy is a healer, facilitator, and weaver of stories. Amy begins by sharing how she met Quanita.
So a mutual friend of ours introduced us, Rashida Manuel. I'll call her by name, bring her into the room. She had said to me, Amy, do you know Quanita? And I knew of Quanita, but we had yet to actually meet. And so we meet over lunch in the Bronte Cafe of Joseph Beth Bookstore, sitting side by side in this booth. And it was clear when we connected in that way that there was something, like I for sure noticed it. A lot of the conversation then was around this leadership and rites of passage program that Quanita was getting ready to launch with her partner, Tennyson Wolf. And at the time, I was in a similar program with Meg Wheatley. And so we shared this connection with Meg Wheatley. And Quanita said to me at the time, like, you really need to be in this other. You need to be in this because this is the more evolved version. This is in the evolution of that lineage and everything. And I was kind of like, really? I don't know. But it was just clear that there was something that was like a connection there. And shortly after, Quanita reached out to say, I think that there's something for us to do. Like, would you be interested in apprenticing for Fire and Water? And I said, what does that mean? She said, I don't know. And so we set up a conversation that was a couple of weeks later for the two of us to explore that possibility, but then also just to kind of sense into like, what was possible in general? What were some projects that she was working on that maybe I could plug into? And in that conversation was where the opportunity of the book kind of came up. And it was clear that there was something there that was like knocking on the door for our attention.
We meet at this coffee shop, second time we've ever been in person with each other. And I say, I have a proposal for you. What about coming in as an apprentice for Fire and Water? And the thing that's interesting about this is I don't invite people into my work. I mean, it was a big deal that I was working with Tennyson to begin with. And we were going outside and she asked about some of the other stuff that I was doing. And I said, one of the things that I'm working on is this book called The InnerGround Railroad. And she got all excited, like, oh, that's interesting. She's like, when am I going to get to hear some of this book? I said, well, I can send you some. I had shared with other people like the first 25 pages of the book. And so I actually didn't think a whole bunch about it. I didn't see this as something, because I didn't know what she was doing, even as something for us to be in together. It was Fire and Water for me. And I had been in relationship with this book at this point for about 14 years. It had been writing me and I've been working, on it. When we left that conversation, she eventually called back and said, okay, she was going to say yes to the apprenticeship program. But the book didn't come clear to me that, oh, this is what we're supposed to do until actually several months later. And Tennyson and I had decided we were going to go back to a writing retreat that Christina Baldwin does called Self as the Source of the Story. And so I just gotten finished that day talking to Christina. I had already sent Amy the first 25 pages of the book. And I said to Christina, I need to stop dragging my feet and get this book done. And then Amy sent me an email that had writing that she had done before we met. And it mirrored a writing that I did in the book before we met. I'll say my part, then you say your part, Amy. It was something to the effect, my part was, I'm a dark-skinned Black woman who is a dark-skinned Black girl born and raised on this side of the Ohio River, the side of the river that represents freedom for so many, but not for me. And then you wrote.
Mm-hmm. I wrote, my name is Amy. I'm a white-skinned woman who lives in Kentucky on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, the river that promised freedom for so many, something like that. And again, we had written this not knowing one another at all, Yeah.
And so I texted her and said, I think you're supposed to write the other side of this book. And she texted me back and said, me too. And I was actually quite moved. Number one is I thought I was dragging my feet. I didn't know I was waiting for her. And that it would happen right in that time. And that the way that the divine works, when something's for you, the flow shows up. There's an ease.
Maybe you can share a little more about just the book. What's the framing? How did it come through you?
Yeah, so the book first came to me. I was in my master's program through Fielding Graduate University, and I was studying organizational development and management with a concentration in integral theory, Ken Wilber's work. I had just started, and it was one night I was up, and the flow of the 40 days came through me. Like I was up writing it that night, like all night. And it was the elements with the diagram medicine wheel. It was overlapping it with the integral theory model. And part of it is I could just get the framework because I actually hadn't learned enough to write the book yet. And so I wrote it and I wrote out the framework and I stuck it in a drawer. And then a little while later, I was doing an independent study for a person for Antioch, and she suggested we use the book Calling the Circle by Christina Baldwin in her study. And so we did. And right as we finished it, Peter Block and Toka Muller were doing an event called the Butterfly Moment, where they were calling in 30 organizational development people from around the world. The person who was coordinating it, I had run into her up in Clifton. I hadn't seen her for like 2 years. And the next day she sends me an email that says, I have one spot left. Do you want it? And I said, of course, yes. And so I go and I meet Christina there. This is my first introduction to Christina and Mary Alice, people, lots of people from the Art of Hosting. Juanita and David were there, Bob Wing. I mean, it was just a lot of people in the field. And so I was in contact with Christina when I had called her several months later to try to get her to come do a circle retreat at a retreat center I was on the board of. And she says, well, let me tell you what you need to do. You need to come and attend this workshop with me, and then I'll come do something with you. So I needed a writing project. So I pulled this out of the drawer and took it to the retreat, and it started to write me a bit. It became clear that first, oh no, my story needed to be a part of it, not just the framework. And so then when I met Amy, I had been writing some from that retreat. I actually wrote a lot, about 17,000 words before I lost it. My computer crashed. And we had a robo drive in our home that was backing up on 2 hard drives, all the computers in the house, except for mine, evidently. So I had to start over. And so I started over and was quite deep in it when I connected with Amy.
Part of it for me, when Quanita shared her story with the book, this relationship, like as she's saying, over 10 years at that point in relationship with this book, what got my attention why I was interested in it is that it really was the story of moving from slavery to freedom. And that one of the things that she said is that this is for my African-American community, but it's for everybody. And for me as a white-bodied person who was also like in that journey of moving, like seeing how whiteness in some ways enslaves us and like cuts us off, separates us from one another, from ourselves, from the divine. Like that was the work that I was doing and feeling very much called into, and feeling at the same time that the work around racial healing and reconciliation and justice is actually what it's doing is we're just reproducing the same old story of supremacy by continuing this paradigm of us, them. And this book, what it does is it really has us side by side looking at how does this wound of white supremacy in particular, although it's like a symptom of a much larger of like capitalism, patriarchy, how does it wound and how does that wound manifest in all of us differently? And so for me, it felt like a tugging, like I couldn't say no because that was the work that I was being called into. And that was I was in that healing journey myself.
Inspired by their book, we asked Amy to read a poem by Khalil Gibran called On Children. As she reads this poem, we invite you to notice your own breath. And then as you notice your breath, pay attention to the words and phrases that strike you in the poem.
And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable.
As we return to the conversation, Amy describes how this poem connects with our book.
That poem is so alive in me now differently. And I think that's the beautiful thing about this book is that we've been birthing this book, and this story's been birthing us. And so it feels just as true now as it did then. It's showing up because it was part of my own healing journey, and I write this in the book. And again, these pieces that are included in the story, know that many of those were true to what they were before. Part of my healing journey and my own work around reconciliation was as a mama with my own daughter, and seeing ways in which, because I hadn't done my own healing, like wounds in me were actually starting to show up, so that I was like, they say that the trauma that's not transformed is transmuted and transferred. And literally, this is what was happening in the story of my daughter and I. And so it was in a therapist office once that the therapist gave me this poem and said, you need to look at this. And that moment when she gave that to me, I came home and just wept, because I could feel that, I could see, despite all my good intentions, that I was like giving Kate, my daughter, not what she needed, but what I needed. Because we can't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And so what does it mean? The invitation to do the work of InnerGround Railroad is to come in and see like, this is in me. And how can I be present to that and listen to that and do that healing so that I can be whole and present in the world and present in the relationships that are there? So just for me as a mom, I'm realizing that I wasn't even really able to see my daughter as she was.
So to bring you in a little bit, Quanita, one of the ways that I experience you is this savant with words who drops little pieces of knowledge and then sort of just walks away and lets people pick up the pieces. And one of the things I know that you're fond of saying is that we don't belong to each other, we are each other. Khalil Gibran is playing with belonging here in this poem as well. Yeah. He's saying your children don't actually belong to you.
Yeah.
I would just love to hear you talk about, why do you make that distinction so clearly, and what does it have to do with this journey to freedom?
So it's interesting because I heard the poem differently today than I probably have ever heard it. There was a yes and in it for me. There was they don't belong to us and they do belong to us. The holding of paradox, which also is often where I find spirit, right? Part of the book and part of the yes and the belonging is that Amy talked about how the wound is passed down from generation to generation until someone heals it. We keep transferring it instead of transforming it. And in the integral theory, one of the things that Wilber teaches is a concept called karma and creativity. And what it is karma is every moment that has happened before that exists in this very moment. And creativity says that in each moment, you can jump the track. So you don't have to keep on that same karma line. But each time we do something, it makes a groove in the universe, which makes it easier to happen again and again and again. And not just for us, but for other people too. And I think oftentimes in spiritual work, we don't make a distinction between the soul and spirit. And spirit to me is the collective we. Deepak talks about the ocean. Spirit is the ocean. We're all a part of the ocean. And the soul is like each drop that we are of the ocean. And I think as humans, sometimes we get a little arrogant and we think we're the whole ocean and not just the drop and the ocean, right? There's a distinction, I think, there. I often will say that everything I am, spirit is, but everything spirit is, I'm not. And for me, it's that in this holding of this poem about our children and us and who we are, the only thing that can show up for us is us. I believe that the universe constantly wants to prove us right. So our belief systems or who we are will show up mirrored from the person in front of us. And so I have a firm belief that when I heal something or I clean up something in me, it can't even show up in my presence because we are each other. We've just forgotten. One thing that I would also like to say about the book that I think when Amy was talking about kind of the core of the book, one of the core concepts is that we're all swimming in the water of what's right, real, and true is white and male. And the problem with that equation is it often takes the divine and nature out of the equation. And then we use that as a yardstick to measure everything: who's healed and who's not, who's successful and who's not, who's wealthy and who's not, who's pretty and who's not. All of it we use that yardstick for. And I think part of the growing up that's being asked of us, I think we're such an adolescent adult culture, is you choosing your own yardstick. You being conscious, first of all, that that's the yardstick we've been using. I often say I don't like the way we use the word privilege these days because it's not privileged to be disconnected from your heart, according to my yardstick. And so, what yardsticks are we using? And is it including nature and the divine?
I got a chance to spend more time with you, Quanita, and get to know you, Amy, last year at the Circle immersion that you hosted with Tennyson. And I was really struck by, and it really stayed with me, that quote that we hold medicine for each other. And that this path towards liberation, we can only actually do side by side, and we can't do for each other. And Amy, you were talking about how like this enslavement shows up uniquely for all of us. Quanita, I remember there was something you had shared about there's sort of a tendency in how it tends to show up for white people versus people of color, and maybe probably Black people specifically because of the history.
That actually is connected to me losing the book. So, one of the things that happened is when the book was deleted and I had to start over, I was belly aching about it for a while. And I think my friends got tired of hearing me say, "Oh my gosh, I can't start." And I was with a friend at his office and he asked me, "What age did you write the book from?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Like those books on the shelf. Some of them are written from young adults, some of them are written from elders, some of them are written from all these different layers." And I had to laugh at myself because I said it was probably adolescent adult. And as you know, it was my stories. And then he says, "Well, what age does a book want to be written from?" And I said, "It wants to be an elder book." And he says, "It's maybe not that those stories aren't supposed to be in the book, but they wanted to be written from a different place." And what I got, and as I was writing and stepping in new, is that that's the promise from the divine, that if we step into our healing journeys, the old stories will be completely taken away and replaced by new ones. And that the first walkthrough was my warrior walk. And that was why I was afraid to go back in, actually, because the warrior walk is having to heal and be in all the wound stuff and be in the mess and the pain of it. And each of those chapters, my stories came from that place. And it was like they were being wrung out of me. And I just couldn't imagine going back there to rewrite them. And so I was afraid because I didn't want to go back in. And what I got is I didn't have to. I had already been through the warrior walk. Now it was time for me to write from the wisdom walk. And the wisdom walk is the wisdom that we've gained from our warrior journey. And what tends to happen in this culture is with the savior victim archetype is that European descendant people tend to want to jump over the warrior walk. They don't want to be in the mess. They don't want to tend with the wounds, and they want to claim the wisdom right away. And then it's just the opposite for people of color. Often we cling on to the warrior walk. We cling on to some of our victim story, and we don't step in and claim the wisdom that we've gained from walking those journeys. And a part of that is in this culture, we tell white people they're supposed to be perfect. And we tell people of color, you never will be. And so there's a clinging to that story that's part of that what's right, real, and true is white and male that we've all been swimming in that keeps us from our healing. But there's something that white people tend to know about the wisdom walk, at least claiming it and stepping into that journey. And there's something that people of color know about being in the mess and the warrior walk that is the medicine for each other.
All of us are in the world of doing the story work in different ways. One of the quotes from the book is the shortest distance between two people is a story. You're talking about this idea of having some agency over what it looks like to author and to reauthor our lives. I would love to hear, Amy, you talk about how do you think about a new way to author and generate stories that is not captured by this imagination of white is right.
I'll just start with the story itself. So when Quanita invited me in to say, like, I think we're supposed to be writing the story, and I said, yeah, me too, because it was clear that this was so much bigger than either one of us. A big piece for me was that feeling, that knowing was met with absolute fear, because here I am as this white woman who's entering into this book, this story that's been alive and working Quanita for over a decade. It was a conversation about slavery and race. How do I find myself into that? A lot of it was around ancestral healing. And at the time, I had no connection really with my ancestors. So that terrified me. And then a big piece of the framing is using the dagger cosmological wheel out of Burkina Faso in West Africa. And I also had no relationship or familiarity with that. So basically, I'm saying yes to this journey and to writing the story and being authored by this thing with a lot of not knowing and a lot of fear. And part of it, I think, is that can we actually listen to fear as an invitation and to be in the not knowing of it and allow and follow that thread into that process and that practice of authorship? Because it's this both and. It's, and I love, Quanita, that you've heard that in the poem today, but for me, this is so much about this book. It's that each of us carries a knowing and a medicine, and simultaneously we're plugged into a much larger thing that we don't know at all. And so the practice of story, the journey is, how do we participate in carrying both the knowing and not knowing that each of us has? When we're talking about the wisdom walk and the warrior walk, these are not things that we knew early on going into, but when we could just listen and discover who we were to each other, what the book was asking for and wanting to be, that was the invitation. So it wasn't like either one of us even knew.
Once again inspired by their book, we asked Quanita to read Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. You're invited to find your breath again. Bring back to mind the words or phrases that struck you from the first poem. Now, as Quanita reads, notice how these two poems are in conversation within you.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air I rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds in the meeting of my thighs? Out of huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise.
Find your breath one last time and notice what's coming up for you in light of these poems and this conversation. Here's Quanita.
I don't think it was for the ancestors that this book would have been written because I didn't want to write the book. Let's be clear. I still at moments don't want to be with the book in relationship with it. And there's something in me that was clear that it's what I've promised to do. One of the things I write about in the book and one of the experiences I had, I was in the Underground Railroad Freedom Center in the slave pen for the first time, and the ancestors started yelling at me. They said, "How dare you? How dare you not be and do all that you've promised with what we went through?" And all I could do is stand there and cry. I mean, what else do you do? Yelling at you like that, because I knew it was true. Standing in that space and that place. And, I left and didn't go back to the Freedom Center for a long time, but I held this, and I didn't find out till later that the slave pen was from a place that my ancestors were enslaved in, so that it was a personal message from them, not just a general one. But there was something in me that knew that I promised to write this book, and it wouldn't let go of me. And in some ways, still won't let go of me. I've said to Amy, I think a part of it is I wrote this book to gift it to her. I still think that that's true, but in a different way than I thought before. I wanted to gift it to her because I didn't want to have it anymore. But I think there is a gifting, there is a holding of this that we each do in a different way. One of the things I often will pray is that the work that I'm doing is honoring the ancestors, Maya Angelou being one of those, because they're all of our ancestors.
I'm laughing a little bit as Quanita says she's gifting it to me, because it's almost been like, in some ways, this story has been a hot potato that we keep trying to get back and forth to each other. When we first met, after I shared my piece with her, the first thing I said to her is like, well, actually, this is your book. And she said, oh, no, that's not how this works. It's interesting, Quanita, hearing you say that piece about the ancestors saying to you, how dare you? And I'm grateful that you're saying that to me today on my birthday. In part because I'm remembering that when we were in Wisconsin writing the book together, I had a dream and my ancestors said the same thing to me. The dream was the exact same thing. And I do think that there's something about, as Quanita was talking about, the spirit and the soul journey that we've been incarnate in this particular lifetime to do. There are things that we're here to do. And when we awaken to that and live into that purpose, it's an actual thing. And I do think that actually, I want to say something about place too, because when you talk about the slave pen and being there, like part of what really helped us awaken to that and get clear on it is that it's this Ohio River. It's not by mistake and coincidence that we are literally bridging this particular river. And I'm aware, and I'm growing in my awareness, that place has a role. Like I remember there was an author once that said place is an active role and character in any kind of story, just as much as the characters themselves are, that there are stories here that have happened that have called me to this particular place. So it's more than just like the ancestors, the shoulders that I stand on. It's like there are stories here that I'm part of. All these things are swimming. So that the question is like, can we awaken as much as we can to what's present in this particular moment? And we need each other to do that. Quanita, I hear you saying like it's a gift to me, and and in some ways it is the poem of Khalil Gibran, The Children. It's like that's birthing us, and we are birthing like, I am this body of work. What does it mean to be this body of work?
We have a section in the book where we ask, why us? Like, why me in this book? And part of it is because I do have a unique background in being raised in white families and in Black families, and going to performing arts, which was under court mandate to have everything be racially balanced, 49-49, and having children that are descendants of slaves and the descendants of the sons and daughters of the American Revolution. So there's a way in which I don't hold either side as victim, and that I haven't, that makes the work cleaner, I think, so that in some ways it's like, that's why it's me. Like for me, Obama being the first Black president, he had to be from African descendant and not slave descendant here. There's something about that allowed him to step in and be who he was to us that I don't think a person whose parents who were from here could have done in the same way.
I was trying to name this tension in this book because it feels like on one hand, you have these archetypal kind of roles. And so often these roles can be cast in terms of an individualistic worldview, which goes back to that yardstick that you were talking about before. And so there's this warring of like personal agency, authoring, freeing myself, and the gifts that we have for each other and the good of the collective. Maybe that tension doesn't need to be resolved, but I would love to hear how you all sort of sort your way through, and how does that play out in this work that you all are doing together?
So one of the things I'll say about archetypes that I wrote in the book and was really clear on, that I use the word, the slave archetype, and I don't talk about enslaved people. And people tend to get upset with me because I think what I found in communities of color is we actually want to avoid that. We want to avoid the slave archetype. But I think the archetypes come to us because they have a light and a shadow. I think we avoid it because we see them as all shadow. But the slave archetype has gifts for us too. The shadow side of the slave archetype is being a slave to a person, a thing, or an idea. But the light side of the slave archetype is being a slave to the divine spirit within. It actually teaches us self-mastery. It's how we find our freedom. And I think part of what gets confusing for people is we want to put a human value judgment on these archetypes instead of the shadow is just the unseen places and the light is where the light is shining, and they actually help free us, right? I love Carol Pearson's The Heroine Within, because she not only talks about the different archetypes that are in each piece of the journey, but she talks about the development and the evolution of each archetype. And that first piece of preparation is about healing the ego journey. And so oftentimes we'll go to a therapist because we have that beginning piece is like, we want to get okay with our job, with our spouse, with our children, with ourselves. We want to be okay, right? We want to find solid ground. So we go to a therapist to help us with the ego journey. Well, the journey itself is a soul's journey. It's where we go into the underworld and meet ourselves. But the thing is, you can't do the soul's journey if you don't have a strong enough ego. And so oftentimes, though, people will be thrown into the soul's journey and they'll go to a therapist, which often is the wrong place to go because they're trying to get you okay with your family, with your job, with yourself. The spirit doesn't care if you lose your job, if you lose your spouse, or if you lose, it just wants you to meet yourself. And then the third part is the self. So the return of this journey is where you actually get to step in and claim, who are you? You get to step in the truth and the beauty of who you are. And so I think what happens is, yes, we have all these other little journeys, and I don't necessarily see it as first half, second half of life kind of things. I think we have a lot of these journeys in a lot of different ways because we're constantly trying to meet ourselves. When I think about that main kind of journey, it's more of the adolescent to adult initiation that I think I tend to speak to. And then, of course, there's still more.
Part of that tension that we're naming or that we're sensing into is it's like, yes. Thank God, because there's something about the unresolved place where like it's more than just the either or that is so ripe. There's generally, I think, a fear of that, but that's in that place of tension where it's like, I'm more than the individual and I'm more than the collective both. That's where there is a possibility for creative innovation, for something new to come out of that place. So how do we hold both that this collective piece, the archetype, and also that I'm more than that or I'm less than that, like that? Those two things together, that's where there's growth, that's where there's life, and that's where there's fear, honestly. And I think like trying not to go there where it's something clean and where we can easily fit into, like that's where we want to stay. It's like what's safe, it's what's familiar. And I think in some ways that's what's hard about the journey, and also that's the gift of it. But I think it's like, how do we move past what we know and into something else? So I think that, yeah, it's not easily resolved, but yes, let's be there.
There's a balancing of the human self and the divine self and the masculine and the feminine in our journeys. And I think so it's like this constant kind of moving thing. It's not like you don't get to a center and you're there.
And just to make this real practical, as a white woman, how do I both see where I fit? I'm part of this collective ancestral story of whiteness and what it means to be white. I'm a white-bodied woman. I cannot ever not be that. My people were that. It's like they can never not be that. And that is not all I am either. It's a place, it's a landscape that's hard sometimes, particularly in the conversation around race, because it's so fully loaded and it's so volatile. And it's very easy to get hooked into these patterns of like, oh yeah, these old stories of what it means to be white in this collective ancestral story around race. And also that there's more to me than that. There's more to us than that. That is really important if we're interested in creating a new, more liberating, loving story.
In the book, you all say that what initiation teaches us is that we all have a unique genius in the world and we need to use it for the world's service. So, Quanita, what's the invitation for us in light of this conversation as it relates to initiation?
I think ultimately what initiation asks of us is that we move from being earth-led in our decision-making to being spirit-led in our decision-making. I think the invitation is, how can I get curious about the decisions I'm making and why I'm making them? There's some ways in which we get caught, like I said, in different places. And so there's a different way in which we're in it. I think everything is purposeful. And so there's a reason why there was an infusion of African-bodied people on this continent. There's something that we know about togetherness, about our unique genius that needed to be reinfused in this country, especially after the indigenous people were being slaughtered, that we have forgotten. And I think we're starting to wake up because we're remembering that we have medicine for here. And I think initiation is how we do that. It's how we step into our own selves. It's how we meet our soul. Our soul meets itself, and it has us ask, what is the deeper question?
Thanks for listening. Check the show notes for more information about Quanita, Amy, and the InnerGround Railroad. This episode has been produced and hosted by me, Joey Taylor, and the music is from Jeff Gorman.